It's Wildlife Wednesday on the Lee Rayburn Show, and our guest David Drake is here to answer your questions about what you're seeing around your area this summer. David Drake is a UW Extension wildlife specialist and professor with the Division of Extension and the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology on the UW-Madison campus. And if you've got wildlife questions, David's got your answers at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. You can also send us an email to talk@wpr.org. And David, welcome back.
Hi, Lee. That's a lot of pressure with that introduction. I have the answers.
I guarantee David will have the answers, or he'll know where to get them. And I gave out the email. We already have an email in. It's a picture that we shared with you, David. And Will in Prairie du Sac emailed us a photo of a squirrel that appears to be in front of a gas station, standing inside of a garbage can while gnawing on a chicken bone. And Will thought that squirrels just ate nuts. What is it about? But evidently they also visit the Quick Trip and have some chicken wings too.
Well, who doesn't? I mean, come on. So that's a great picture, and I would assume that if you want to go onto Google and just Google, gray squirrel trash can, you're going to find pictures like this all over the internet because it is a relatively common picture. Especially squirrels are they're in that urban environment, a common resident of that urban environment. And they have done a very good job of taking advantage of both direct food sources that we provide for them and indirect food sources. So direct food source might be something like residential bird feeders, which is a real frustration to a lot of people. But indirect food sources, they certainly will eat out of trash cans, as that picture depicts. And yes, it's a squirrel in a trash can with what does appear to be a chicken bone. Squirrels are primarily, and we're talking about, this is a gray squirrel. We've got a variety of squirrel species in Wisconsin and over in Minnesota, but this is a gray squirrel. Squirrels are typically herbivores, so they do eat a lot of nuts, vegetation, things like that. But they also do eat some insect matter, and they will eat birds, young birds and bird eggs occasionally. So they are to some extent omnivorous. And it might be with that chicken bone, it might be eating a little meat off the chicken for some protein. But small mammals like mice and voles and things like that will also gnaw on bones of animals that have died for the calcium.
Oh.
And so it may also be eating the bone for the calcium.
So these squirrels are omnivores. They just find whatever they can get. It's not just nuts for them. And when we're talking about omnivores, I also think of our local raccoons in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And I think raccoons have been on a lot of people's mind recently. I mean, they're cute. They sort of wobble around. But you've got this raccoon in Seattle that has become this international sensation. They call him Jimothy. And I think it's because he prances as opposed to wobbles around. And this evidently is a result of some sort of spinal defect. But everybody loves Jimothy.
Yeah, Jimothy is a viral sensation right now. He's taken over from Patches. Or was it Patches? Or what was the monkey in Japan?
I don't remember.
Not Patches. Anyway, there was a monkey in Japan that was in a zoo that had not been adopted by its mother, and so that became a global sensation for a while. Where everybody's heart went out to this monkey. So this has taken over. Jimothy is now taken over the new viral sensation, and it does seem that. The woman who took the video and put it up on social media, she said it just looked like a Jimothy. So they don't know if it's a male or female. But Jimothy is an interesting name. And apparently, even though it is a recent viral sensation, that an animal like this, if not this one, has been seen around Seattle over the last year or so. So this is not a new animal, but it does apparently it has some kind of a spinal deformity. They think it's like what's called a short spine syndrome. And it also looks like it doesn't have much of a tail. So it doesn't look necessarily like your typical raccoon, but it certainly is cute. And again, a lot of people are anthropomorphizing this animal or attaching human emotions and feelings to it. And it is the recent viral sensation until another animal takes over.
Punch was the name of the monkey.
Punch.
Yeah.
That's right.
And
Punch.
it's a good,
Yeah.
interesting comparison because we can't help but connect with these animals. And
Yes.
at first, it's just because it's cute, because it's a prancing raccoon, when usually you're
Yep.
used to the wobbly raccoons that are ambling around your neighborhood. But on second thought, there's also this survival thing about raccoons that, if they have some sort of deformity or if they are somehow injured, you assume they probably aren't going to make it very long in the wild, that they're at a competitive disadvantage in
Yeah.
the wilderness. But in urban areas, and maybe this speaks more to raccoons in general, they have this survivability that in any area across Wisconsin, and evidently in Seattle as well, they can thrive.
Yeah. Animals do quite well. And, I think it's a natural human emotion that our hearts go out to these animals that we think need some help.
Yeah.
And animals typically, they handle pain much differently than we do. And so we see an animal that we perceive to be in pain or perceives that needs our help. And the animal may not actually need our help because they are surviving and adapting with whatever deformity or injury they may have, and they have to keep going because if they don't, either they're going to get eaten by something or they're going to perish because they're not able to secure the necessary resources, food and shelter and things like that. So they don't really have an option to just lay on the couch and watch reruns of I Love Lucy until they feel better. So they've got to keep going. But our natural instinct as a human is like, well, should do something to help that animal. And that isn't always the case because a lot of times, if we do try to intervene as humans, that we actually may cause more stress or anxiety for that animal and make things worse. And a lot of times, animals don't need our help. And the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has an awesome campaign called Keep Wildlife Wild, where they help people understand, should you intervene? Should you contact a wildlife rehabilitation clinic or facility or not, or just leave the animal be? And the common example we talk a lot about is if people find a rabbit nest in their backyard or someplace in their yard, especially earlier in the spring or summer, that people don't see the mom around that rabbit nest and they assume that the nest has been abandoned. Well, then the way that the mom naturally feeds these animals, she feeds them in the morning, and then she might come back in the evening and feed them. And the less time she spends around that nest, the less attention she's drawing to the nest. So she's not actually drawing potential predators to that nest. So it's actually a survival instinct or a survival tactic. And so sometimes we just need to educate the human population that, yeah, Punch looks a little lonely perhaps, or Jimothy looks kind of a little funky, but they're okay. And they'll be just fine without us.
David, how do animals handle or process pain differently than us? And are they're not? I don't think they're tougher than we are, but what's the reason?
Yeah, I think I'm not. This is not my area of expertise, but I've done some reading on this, and it's just the way that for one thing, pain sensors and the way that they process pain is different, partly, and it doesn't mean to say that they don't experience pain because certainly they do, and we, for example, at the University of Wisconsin here, as all other research institutions, that we have an animal care use committee and policies to ensure that as we do research with animals, that we're not causing undue pain or pain that doesn't need to be treated or mitigated in some way. So animals certainly do feel pain. It's just that they don't have that luxury of stopping life until that pain goes away or until that injury gets better. Where we would go to the hospital, for example. And it's also is part of nature is that animals. Not every animal survives, and ultimately every being is going to die eventually at some point anyway. But in nature, animals don't have long lifespans. Some animals don't, some do, depends
Sure.
on the species. But that's part of the food web is that those animals that are sick or injured or old, that they may get picked off easier by predators, and that's intended so that you kind of call out the weak genes, so you don't breed those types of genes. It also is an opportunity for predators to get fed and survive.
And then to anthropomorphize the likes of Jimothy, it can't help but make you root for him. Go Jimothy. You
Oh,
can do it.
Jimothy.
You
So
can
so
make
your
it.
team your team Jimothy, is that right?
We're all Team Jimothy, David.
Okay.
David Drake, our guest, UW Extension wildlife specialist, answering your questions today about Wisconsin's wildlife at 1-800-642-1234 or email talk@wpr.org. You wrote a paper with UW Extension, Wisconsin DNR, and USDA Wildlife Services about raccoons, David, along with another guest of the show, Scott Craven. And it is a fascinating discussion because I learned a lot about these little animals that I'm most likely to find coming up from the gutters in my neighborhood, or most likely to find lounging in the dumpsters around my neighborhood. But they've got sort of an intricate life that they live without us ever really seeing much of it.
Yeah, so raccoons are an incredible species. So they're a mammal, obviously. They're also classified as fur bearers because they have fur. They are a native species, so they have evolved, you know, in this area, and they belong in this area as a native species of wildlife. And they're very, very common. So they're throughout the entire state. They're active year round, so they don't hibernate. They are true omnivores. They will eat plant material, they eat animal material. They are extremely adaptable. They are extremely opportunistic. They are pretty dang strong for their size. You don't really want to mess with a raccoon if you don't have to. And they are extremely intelligent. And I've got some colleagues who are at the University of California, Berkeley, and up in the University of British Columbia, who've done some really fascinating puzzle studies with raccoons, where they create these puzzle boxes and the raccoon actually, they put them out in the wild, and then they put cameras on these boxes, and they have little treats inside the boxes, and the raccoons have to actually learn how to unlock a lock, for example, or to pull open a drawer, or a little or open a little cabinet opening, and actually then reach in and grab this treat. And then it's fascinating to watch, because when they come back, then they know which door to go to, where the treat is, for example, or sometimes the treats get moved around. But it's really interesting to watch how these wild animals actually solve puzzles, and they are really, really smart animals.
Well, another way they do it, David, is with their little human hands. Hard not to anthropomorphize these animals when they've got human hands.
They have these little human hands, and they are very adroit with those little hands.
Yes.
And as you mentioned up at the front of the program, is, they do wash, or what's considered washing their food. But what people think is that they take their food and wash it in the water before they eat it, and that's not necessarily the case. They may do that, but what they're probably doing more likely is that they are using those hands that are very tactile, that they're actually feeling through the mud to see if they can't find some invertebrates, or maybe a crayfish or something like that they would eat. And so they are really, really interesting animals. They are other also pretty common carriers of diseases. So
Yeah.
that's another reason you don't necessarily want to interact directly with raccoons. They can scratch, they can bite. They conceivably could carry rabies, although they're not one of the more common carriers of rabies in Wisconsin. They have raccoon ringworm. They're sometimes susceptible to distemper. So they do carry some diseases that are zoonotic, or could pass on to human beings. So admire raccoons from a distance.
Sound advice. I had a friend who said that the raccoons had made a bathroom location in their yard. Do they
Hmm.
have central places? Do they build like outhouses, kind of?
Yeah, it's not exactly an outhouse made out of popsicle sticks, but it's something similar. They do what's called latrines. So they will, and there are other animals that do this as well. So mink will do this sometimes, but they will defecate in a central area, or the same area, over and over again. And so sometimes you can find piles of scat that are raccoon, generated scat in a very localized area, and that would be called a latrine. And it's a raccoon scat because a lot of times, if you start breaking it apart, or sometimes you can visibly see it, they have quite a bit of seed matter in their scat, especially at this time of the year, where there's so many abundant seeds available for them to eat.
And would that be a concern when you talk about ringworm then?
Yeah, I think we get a lot of questions and emails sometimes about people finding scat in their raccoon scat in particular in their yard. And I think you certainly don't want to use your bare hands and start sorting through it to see what they've eaten unnecessarily. But I think if you were to touch it, you don't have to be terribly concerned. But you should wash your hands with warm water and soap, and do that for 30 seconds or so before you prepare food or
My neighbor
chew your
was,
nails
yeah,
or
my neighbor was
whatever.
worried about the dog. And
Yeah.
if there is a way to move the latrine or find a better location for these raccoons to go?
Yeah, so what you're trying to do is disrupt that animal's behavioral pattern. So the retrieving. So one thing is, raccoons obviously are nocturnal, but one of the reasons they're nocturnal is because they feel safe at night, and it's harder for them to be seen under the cover of darkness. So if you have a temporary motion sensor spotlight, for example, you might set that up over the latrine so that as an animal or a raccoon specifically comes and breaks that beam, that light will go on, then the raccoons don't feel as comfortable if they're spot lit. So that might be one thing to do. Clean that latrine up, maybe spray some Clorox bleach or something like that around there, to try to discourage them from that manner. If you can put up some kind of a fence material or exclude them, although raccoons are extremely good climbers, so just be aware of that. But and I think if you see it, just go and get a shovel and pick it up, and then just discard it. But from a dog standpoint, unless the dog is eating that scat, that it probably is not that big of an issue for your dog.
Let's go to Bruce next in La Crosse. Hi, Bruce.
Hello. I've been traveling around for a long time, and I have a thought on raccoons. I'm firmly convinced that if it weren't for automobiles, raccoons would rule the world.
What makes you think that, Bruce?
Well, the way we get rid of them generally is to hit them with a car.
Man, it's kind of sad to see them on the side of the road, and when our technology meets our wildlife, it can be tragic. And would there be an opportunity for raccoons to somehow rule the world someday, David, with those little human hands and their bright brains?
Yeah, probably not rule the world, but they can certainly uh, you know achieve pretty high densities, especially in urban areas. They can for sure. But they do get hit by cars. They do get eaten by other animals, so coyotes and things like that. Especially some of the smaller raccoons that might be young, they might get eaten by owls or hawks and things of that nature. And because they're a fur bearer, they also get trapped by recreational trappers in particular. And even though fur prices aren't that high these days, and there's fewer and fewer trappers each year, there is they do get trapped quite often as well.
You mentioned they're young, and we talked earlier about rabbit nests, and I don't think I've ever seen any baby raccoons. I imagine they're cute, but
They are.
where are they hiding?
Well, raccoons are cavity nesters, so they will nest in cavities of trees or holes in trees typically. So that's their natural area. But I had a friend and a colleague who did a study in New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale University is located. And so one of the things I mentioned about raccoons is they're extremely adaptable and they're also very opportunistic. And so artificial cavities would be your chimney. And so he did a study in New Haven, Connecticut, and what he found, I think, if I remember the statistics correctly, is that residential chimneys that did not have a chimney cap on them, I think of his sample, 85% of those chimneys had either raccoons in them or had evidence that raccoons had been in them at one point. And then he excluded the raccoons, trapped them out of the chimney, put a radio collar on some of them, put a chimney cap on those chimneys, and then I think it was 72% of the raccoons that they radio collared went back to a different chimney that did not have a radio cap on it. So, or excuse me, a chimney cap on it. So they
Wow.
are primarily cavity nesters, and they will nest in either artificial or natural cavities.
So, when do we find baby raccoons? How long does it take for them to leave their cavities?
Yeah, so typically, I'm going to have to go back to my early ecology training on this, Lee. But typically, it's I believe in the springtime is when they are primarily birthing. And I'm assuming I don't know this off the top of my head, but I'm assuming that the gestation period is probably a few months. I could look that up, and they probably, nurse or stay with the mom for, I don't know, maybe a month or two, something like that. I would guess. I can look that up on a break and give you a more specific answer, but and then they're off on their own.
Okay. And if they do become a nuisance, David, what should I do? If they are in my chimney,
Yeah.
who should I call? If they've become a nuisance in my yard or in the dumpster out back, what can I do?
Yeah, it depends on the time of the year. So if they are in your chimney, for example, then probably the easiest thing to do is to obviously set a live trap and trap them out of there. But you may also have to contend with the young. So if you
Mm.
trap the mom or the adult, then you're going to also have to trap the young out of there. Otherwise, the young are going to perish if they don't, depending on where they are in the nursing stage, if they've weaned, things of that nature. So it may be best to call a professional, wildlife control operator that you can find on the internet to do something like that. You're certainly able and welcome to do it by yourself if you want to do that as a homeowner or a building owner. Um, and it really depends on the specific situation. So a lot of people also complain or have questions about raccoons if they get into their garden. One of the best things to do at that point is to try to either trap them or to, if you can, fence them out. Although I mentioned they're good climbers. So if you're going to use some kind of fencing material, you need to probably angle the fence outward so the top of the fence is further out than the bottom of the fence, because raccoons are very good climbers, but they can't necessarily hold themselves upside down because of their weight and get up over that fence. If it's safe for you to do so, and you're not in a truly residential area, you might be able to use electric fencing or combine an electric fence with an exclusionary type fence. But you
Ooh.
want to make sure you're not, shocking pet dogs, the kids' neighbors, anything, or the neighborhood kids, things like that. If you are trapping an animal, this is not unique to raccoons, but if you live trap an animal, by the law, you cannot release that animal on property you don't own. It doesn't matter if it's private property or public property.
Huh.
You need the either the private property owner's permission or the manager of that public property's permission to do that. So live trapping becomes a little bit of a problem because you may have caught this animal, but now where do you release the animal? So that's an issue. But fencing's a good one. Harassment, as we talked about, the using maybe some kind of a motion censored light, or they have motion censored water sprinklers that you can use. That might be something to
Ooh.
do, something like that. Or if you're talking about just an individual plant or tomato plant, you might want to just fence that one plant out.
And just to reiterate what you said earlier, David, that we should be keeping wildlife wild, and there are plenty of reasons to do so. And the DNR has information on the website that just because they're cute doesn't mean that we have any business with them necessarily.
Right. Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right. So, I think again, I always talk about this adage, everybody's got an opinion about politics and religion, and you can certainly add wildlife to that. And if you don't believe me, this Friday night when you're out for a fish fry, just ask somebody what they think about wolves or deer, and
Oh
you're gonna
my.
be there all night, and fisticuffs may ensue. Who knows? But yes, it is awesome that so many people are enthralled and enthusiastic about wildlife. It is fantastic for all sorts of different reasons. But the best thing to do is observe wildlife from a distance, and you be safe and the wildlife be safe.
And when it comes to the winter time, you mentioned that they don't hibernate. I've got about a minute here, David, but what
Yeah.
do they do? Because I'm hard pressed to find them in my neighborhood.
Yeah, so they eat a lot. They'll put on fat reserves for that. They also, as fur bearers do in the wintertime, is that they will increase their fur, so their coat will come into what's called prime, and so they'll have a thicker coat on to survive the winter like that. We talked about them using cavities, so they'll get into a cavity and sleep in a sheltered area in a tree or in your chimney, and that will protect them from some of the cold wind and the snow and things like that.
They're survivors. Our guest, David Drake, for Wildlife Wednesday. He's a UW Extension wildlife specialist and professor. Taking your questions at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. Jim and Wausau, if you can hang on, we'll get to you in just a couple minutes. You can also send us an email, and that includes pictures. If you've got any other pictures of squirrels eating chicken wings, we'll take those as well at talk@wpr.org. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you're listening to WPR News. Wildlife Wednesday on the Lee Rayburn Show, and it started with a squirrel eating a chicken wing. From there, we began to talk about all the things that raccoons may eat, and now we've got a bunch of questions from you about these raccoons for our guest, David Drake, UW Extension wildlife specialist and professor with the Division of Extension and the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology on the UW-Madison campus. And let's get right to it with Jim and Wausau. Hi, Jim.
Hi. I've had the raccoon problems forever here. They wreck our bird feeders, and they do go after the garden. But our garden right now is fenced 2 feet high for rabbits and small critters. 3 inches above that is an electric wire. And that keeps them out of there. But the first year I started trapping raccoons, I caught and killed 35.
Wow.
And I think I cleared the neighborhood out, but people in town were dumping them on our land.
Why were they doing that? And did you catch them?
No, I didn't catch them doing it, but there's no way that would be natural reproduction.
Yeah, 35 in 1 year, and yet they kept showing up, David. And as you talked about it, that would be illegal to be dumping any trapped raccoons on anybody's land.
Yes, it is illegal in the state of Wisconsin to release a live trapped animal. It doesn't matter what the species is on property you don't own without that property owner's permission. So, but I will say, depending on where the caller lives, densities of animals, so the number of individuals per species can be pretty high in cities. So 35 raccoons in a city may not be out of the question, specifically. So, and as you start kind of creating a void there, other animals are going to start filling it in, and so it becomes a bit of a conveyor belt issue.
Nature abhors a vacuum, right? So
That's
if
right.
you eliminate 35 raccoons, that may make space for 35 more raccoons.
35 more, that's right.
So
That's exactly right.
what would the solution be for somebody like Jim who's got this nuisance of a raccoon, and every time he clears one out, one comes right back in?
Yeah, I think there is something to that adage: if you can't beat them, learn to live with them, and that might be some of it too. Is that and it really is the specific situation. So Jim talked a little bit about the garden, and it sounds like he's got the garden pretty well under control with the fence and both the exclusionary fence, the barrier fence, and the electric fence. But with bird feeding, it depends on what time of the year is going on. But right now, if we recommend a lot of times, especially if you're in the northern part of the state, to take your bird feeders down, because they also might attract black bears. And right now, birds don't need any help from a food sense because there's such an abundance of food on the landscape anyway. And this is a dirty little secret, is that birds don't really need our help any time of the year, even in the dead of winter. They typically have evolved with the conditions of winter, and they've figured out how to find enough food to survive and things like that over time. And so we don't necessarily need to feed them even in the winter, although it is not a bad thing to do because it brings a lot of joy to people. It increases people's human nature connection. It educates people about birds and the greater wildlife world. So it's not a bad thing to do. But if Jim's having trouble with raccoons, certainly take the feeders down for a period of time, let them find a different food source. And that might be where a 2 or 3 week period where you've got the feeders in your garage or someplace secure, and then put them back out and try it. There are other feeders that you might want to use. Like, for example, raccoons are very strong and they'll pull feeders down and they'll break feeders to get access to the food. But like those two feeders that have thistle or the Niger seed in it, that's a feeder that is inaccessible to raccoons because they can't get their paws or tongue into those little slots for the thistle seed. Or there are feeders that have kind of cages around them that might prevent access. There's other ways you probably could hang the feeders that might exclude raccoons, or use these baffles on feeder poles. That baffle is kind of like a cone that prevents the raccoon from climbing all the way up the pole to the feeder. So there are some strategies that Jim might want to try for the feeders.
And thank you for the call, Jim. I am sure you are not alone, and I think I've got the proof coming up here with our next caller. So let's go to Rick and Hobart next. Hi, Rick.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I just wanted to call in and mention that the DNR has a website that lists licensed trappers by county. So I had an experience with a mother and her kits, and on a Sunday afternoon, I called the DNR, and they pointed me to this source so I could find a licensed trapper. And the other fascinating thing about his work was that he used sardines and little marshmallows as the bait. The sardines because they're really stinky, and I guess the raccoons love them. And the little mushrooms because, as you mentioned before, their hands are so adroit, they like to play and squish the marshmallows.
So that would bring all the raccoons to the yard. Some stinky sardines and mushy marshmallows. That makes a lot of sense to me, Rick. What about you, David?
Well, Rick makes a very good point. The Wisconsin Trappers Association, which is an organization in Wisconsin of licensed ethical trappers who are recreational trappers, that they have a website. So Wisconsin Trappers Association, if you want to just Google that. And on their website, they've got a drop-down menu, and they will list trappers in counties in the state of Wisconsin. So not every county has trappers, but usually you can find a county that in a neighboring county that would have trappers in there. But trappers have offered their services to come out and help people trap animals. And it could be a raccoon, it might be a coyote, it might be whatever the case it might be. Some will do it for free, some may charge a fee to do it, but that's a resource for people who aren't quite sure about how to handle an animal, and especially if you want to trap it, how to do that. So these trappers are licensed. They'll know all the laws and regulations. They'll know how to do it using best management trapping practices to do it humanely and things like that. And the last thing I'll mention is raccoons like sweet baits. So one of the things that you would bait a live trap with in particular is either marshmallows, or sometimes people will put like jam, strawberry jam on a piece of bread and just throw it in the back of the trap. And raccoons are very susceptible to sweet baits like marshmallows.
Rick, thank you so much for the call, and I will remember the stinky sardines and mushy marshmallows, which I figured that there are plenty of dumpsters in my neighborhood where those can be found. Let's go to Mike in Sun Prairie next. Hi, Mike.
Hey, thanks. My question was around, I know when raccoons their population becomes too dense or oversaturated, they can affect other species. Like, I think a common one I've heard of is turkeys. They invade the nest. I'm just wondering whether in a city setting or a rural setting, when their population is too dense, what species they impact.
Yeah, David, so if raccoon populations become too dense, what does this mean for the other wildlife in the area?
Yeah, it depends on the species, but raccoons are, as I mentioned, they're omnivores, so they will take advantage of what food is available to them. So they may focus on plant material. They might focus on insects, depending on what's abundant and available at that time of the year, that season. They also might focus on bird eggs. So they do certainly like bird eggs. And the caller talked about turkeys. So there's a lot of different animals that will predate a turkey nest, which is on the ground. So you might have possums, skunk, raccoons, snakes might eat turkey eggs. your pet dog, or might also be interested in something like that if they can get a hold of it. So they possibly could impact a variety of bird species. They certainly will eat, young squirrels and other small animals and nests like that. But typically, again, in urban areas, that not only are the raccoons increasing, but other species, all the other species are typically increasing in density as well, just again, because it's such a resource-rich area. If you go out into non-urban areas like rural areas, typically there's a little bit more of a natural balance in some of these rural areas. One of the things about raccoons is they are what's called an unprotected species or a non-protected species through state law and Wisconsin Department of Natural Resource regulations. So in areas where either you own the land or you rent the land, if you have a raccoon that is causing problems, that you can lethally manage that raccoon legally without a hunting license to do so, or a trapping license to do so. But as long as the type of method you choose to lethally manage that animal is legal. So, for example, in the country, you might be able to shoot that animal. In the city, you can't discharge a firearm legally. So it really depends on what's going on. But out in the country, there's more options. The densities aren't as high. You might have more predation. There's other factors going on to kind of control that raccoon population. So in the country, they probably don't have as much of an impact on species like they potentially could have in the city, but their impact is probably somewhat muted even in the city.
Christian emailed us and asked if you could speak to the differences between urban raccoons and wild raccoons. He said he's heard there are distinct genetic differences.
Yeah, so there's been some studies. A colleague of mine down in Chicago, who's also runs the Chicago Coyote Project, they've been looking at some of this, and there's been some studies coming out recently that kind of the genetic. I don't know if it's necessarily genetic structure, but the way that raccoons kind of survive and process information and live is different in the city, especially if you have multi-generations of raccoons in the city compared to the country. And I'm not sure that the science is fully developed to be definitive about this, but it is an interesting hypothesis and theory that they're starting to explore, no doubt.
So I've heard of city mouse and country mouse. This is the first I'm hearing of city raccoon and country raccoon.
Yeah.
Thanks for the email, Kristen. I had no idea this research was ongoing. David Drake, our guest, and back to your questions next. Kathy and Madison, how are you?
Oh, I'm well. Can you hear me?
You're loud and clear.
Okay. So I live in the east side of Madison, and we certainly have raccoons here, and they've never been a trouble to me and most people. But we, on my walks years ago with my dog, who's now gone, but, we'd encounter a raccoon. One time he was so curious about this growling sound coming from the sewer as we walked past. Anyway, we've had a lot of interesting experiences, nothing hazardous. But anyway, one summer I was sitting on my front porch, and Mama Raccoon was crawling out of the sewer, and she crawled up and she looked around, and then she went back down, and she crawled up and went, came again and then went back down. And then eventually she crawled up and about 6 babies followed her, and she probably went to a compost pile, right? But I'm wondering, we had road construction. The roads were reconstructed. Obviously that disrupts everything. And I haven't seen any raccoons since then. So I'm just wondering, what happens to raccoons when their whole world is turned upside down?
It's an interesting question, Kathy, and some great stories. So I've got sewer raccoons too, and if that sewer undergoes redevelopment, what happens when they lose their habitat, or that chimney gets a chimney cap? What happens to that raccoon family? You say we've talked about how adaptable they are, but what does it mean when their world gets turned upside down, like Kathy asks?
Yeah, they probably go. They are certainly, depending on the disruption, they are probably temporarily displaced. So they may have to move temporarily, but keep in mind that construction is not going on most of the time. It's not going on 24 hours a day. So it's during the daytime, not during the nighttime. And raccoons are active primarily during the nighttime. So they still may be able to use that area, that localized area, depending on the level of disruption or what exactly is going on. They still may be there. You just may not see them as often because they're maybe changing their activity patterns a little bit to adapt to the disruption, they may be temporarily displaced and actually have to move someplace else. So they may move 2 blocks over or 3 blocks over if there's a space for them, or if other raccoons will allow them into that area. And so it probably depends, but keep in mind in the city, there's so much going on in the city, and these animals are constantly adapting to different things and changes and stuff like that. So for them to move and pick up life 2 blocks over is probably not that big of a deal relative to. And then when the sewer project gets done or the construction gets done, they'll come back, and most likely, if they don't, some other raccoon will come back and inhabit that area.
You talked about that you can use lethal force to eliminate these raccoons. Dan emailed us to say that you can actually eat them too, and they are darn tasty. There are plenty of recipes online, says Dan. So I had not considered that as a potential protein source, David.
Yes, I have tasted raccoon before. It is not the worst in the world, but I'm not sure that I'm picking raccoon a la carte over lobster bisque any day at a nice restaurant. But if you can get past the fact that you're actually eating raccoon, it's not. I mean, it's not the worst.
A little gamey, maybe.
Especially if you're hungry, maybe a little bit. Yeah.
Dan,
but each to their own.
Thank you for the email. Let's go to Tom in Green Bay next. Hi, Tom.
If you're going to eat them, take the glands out first.
Sound
anyway,
advice.
Raccoon populations are very high. We probably have more raccoons in the state right now than ever. A lot of that has to do with our agriculture. And they are a major predator. They were the major predator on raptor nests, woodland raptors, until the fisher took off, and the fisher has basically outclassed them in every way by taking adult females too off of nests. But the numbers are unbelievable. I've had dens in my yard. A few years ago up at Peninsula State Park, they had a problem with raccoons. They hired a trapper after the season. They took out over 300 raccoons just out of Peninsula State Park. And they still have a problem today.
Yeah, that goes back to the idea that just eliminating the population isn't going to control the population but as you talk about how they reproduce, David, are they reproducing in such numbers that they're able to keep up no matter how much we trap and kill?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about I'm not sure about how many raccoons we have in the state of Wisconsin, and I don't believe the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the agency that's tasked with managing raccoons and all other free-ranging wildlife species, I'm not sure that they keep track of the population. What I do know is that there's a healthy trapping season every year. They're a non-protected species, so you can harvest them or lethally manage them on property that you own or rent where it's legal to do so. So there is a lot of lethal management or removal of individuals from the population every single year, in addition to the roadkill we talk about and some other things like that, predation, disease, whatever the case might be that we don't see. So there is a healthy raccoon population, or that's the assumption for sure. And I think the facts would back that up. But they do breed. They will replace themselves. They have a healthy litter size. And I did look it up, I should say, Lee, while we were on the break. So they breed primarily April, May, or I'm sorry, that's when they give birth, is primarily April, May. They can give birth anytime between March and June. It is about a 2-month gestation period. So that's how long they would carry the young inside of them. And then it's about a 2-month period until the young get active, and they stay with the mom for about 5 months before they leave. So, but there is a lot of raccoon mortality, but there's also a lot of raccoon reproduction and offsetting of that mortality.
We talked about beavers last week and how close they were driven to extinction, and how how they may have a important role to play in our ecosystem. Fur bearers, like raccoons. Fur bearers have been trapped and kept for their fur as well, but their populations never seem to have waned. If anything, as Tom mentioned, that their populations could be as big as ever. It's just an interesting comparison to me, and not lost on the discussion of beavers last week.
Yeah, I think it depends on the species. I mean, we did as a population, human population, we trap beavers pretty extensively, and they were pretty low in numbers decades ago. Obviously, we've done the same thing to wolves. A lot of the fur bear species, especially if we fear them or find them to be a problem to us, we have persecuted them in many different ways and pretty aggressively throughout our history, and have driven quite a few populations to a pretty precipitous decline. Thankfully, they're coming back now and are actually doing quite well. But that has to do with obviously more strict regulations and legal frameworks in place. There's not as many people who hunt and trap as there were decades ago. Animals adapt to different changing landscapes and things of that nature. So thankfully they are coming back. But yes, there are a lot of parallels and similarities between a lot of these fur bear species in terms of history and population levels and things like that.
Let's go to Vicki in Eau Claire next. Hi, Vicki.
Hi, I have a suggestion for raccoon baffle for a bird feeder on a metal post. My husband used some galvanized piping material. I don't know if you found the pattern online or where, and it's been very successful, and it's fun to watch the squirrels try to get under it to get up the pole. If you go online, just put raccoon baffle, you'll get do-it-yourself projects as well as ones that are manufactured. But if you have a long pipe-like structure around your bird post, your bird feeder post, that'll take care of it.
Thank you, Vicki. My grandfather spent a good portion of his retired life trying to keep other animals out of his bird feeders, and it was always so much fun to watch. It was novel, it was creative. Sometimes it might have been arguably cruel, but it was always a real entertaining time outside the living room window in Kohler. So I appreciate that very much, Vicki.
And I bet you the squirrels outlasted them, didn't they?
Every time. They win every time. That was kind of what made it so much fun.
That's right.
It was just a matter of how they were going to beat my grandfather this round.
That's right.
So.
But I love what it sounds like, his persistence and his optimism. I'm going to get those squirrels today. But to go back to, I think it was Vicki's point, is, if you put a piece of sheet metal or something like that on your bird feeder post, that's slippery enough that squirrels and raccoons and things like that can't get purchased, or they can't grab onto it. But keep in mind, a squirrel is not nearly as long as a raccoon. So for raccoons, they can reach up quite a bit. You're going to need a pretty long piece of sheet metal to make sure that the raccoon can't reach above it as it's standing on the ground, or as it's perching on the post with its back legs.
Vicki, thank you for the call. Let's go to Patty in Coon Valley next. Hi, Patty.
Hi. Well, we inadvertently lured a raccoon into our house by having melons sitting out on the counter.
Oh, boy.
And the kitchen window led right out to our front porch. And unfortunately, our love seat was pushed up against the wall underneath the window, and the raccoon sliced a hole in the screen. He and one of his 5 babies came in to the house. The other 4 couldn't get in because they pushed the love seat away from the screen, and they ended up in our through 2 rooms and into our family room, where our son happened to be sleeping that day.
Oh!
And he woke up, saw the raccoons, and closed the door behind them, and we did have an outside door in there. So first they scattered, ran all over, and the baby, I think, lost control of its bowels, because the mom went out quickly out of the door, but the baby stayed in and soiled many places in our room, even crawled up on an area that had the TV, and we found feces on the TV. So it was a lesson learned.
Yeah, don't put the melon by the window, right? I mean,
right. Holy smokes! But what do you expect in Coon Valley? Right. So
named for a reason.
Yes, named for a reason. That was what was going through my mind before you even mentioned it, is once they got in the house, how much damage do they do inside the house? Because they can be pretty destructive, and as they're trying to get out, and as I mentioned, they're strong animals, but to defecate and probably urinate and other things like that, that would be some damage.
Which brings us back full circle. Thank you so much for the story, Patty, that we need to be able to keep wildlife wild for their sake and for ours, David.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely.
And there are good reasons for it, not the least of which is the damage they can do inside your home and the amount of defecation that it can do inside a bedroom.
Oh, my goodness. Your poor son.
But a perfect way to end the hour. And David Drake, thank you so much. I can't believe we spent an hour. I can totally believe we spent an hour on raccoons today.
Right.
But next time, I promise we'll move on to something else. It's a fascinating discussion, and so grateful to have you along for the ride, David. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rick. Have a good day, Lee.
You as well.
Bye-bye.
David Drake, UW Extension Wildlife Specialist and Professor with the Division of Extension in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology on the UW-Madison campus. And thank you for all your calls. So sorry we didn't get to all of them or your emails, but David will be back next month, and we look forward to the opportunity. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you're listening to WPR News. Here's how the story starts from Danielle Kading at WPR.org/news from a few weeks ago. Conservation advocates in Wisconsin say the Trump administration's rollback of the Endangered Species Act threatens habitat that is crucial for endangered and threatened species in our state. We're talking about this hour on the Lee Rayburn Show with two guests. We'll speak with Stan Temple, who is a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation, in a few minutes. But I want to start with Adena Rissman, who is a professor of natural resources policy and management at UW-Madison, to help explain what has happened and what we could expect next. And we invite your questions about this change to the Federal Endangered Species Act and what it could mean for the endangered and threatened plants and animals in Wisconsin. You can join our conversation at any time at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. Or send an email to talk@WPR.org. And Adena Rissman, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Let's start with a little bit of the news and what happened last month and how it happened.
Sure. So last month, the federal administration put out a new rulemaking that rescinds the definition of harm and says that harm does not include significant habitat destruction that actually kills or injures a species, which has been the long-standing definition of harm for about the last 50 years, as the two administrative agencies have implemented the Endangered Species Act, and that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries for marine species. Here in Wisconsin, it's mostly the Fish and Wildlife Service that is involved.
So this was a rule change to the Endangered Species Act, which is a law. How was the law able to be amended with just a simple rule change? How did that happen?
So that's really important. Actually, the law has not changed. The Endangered Species Act, as you mentioned, was passed by Congress in 1973. But for every law, there's a lot of questions about how it should be implemented, and these are decided by the agencies through a rulemaking process. People can go to regulations.gov, and they can look at all the things that the agencies are doing. And so it gets a little bit in the weeds, but it's pretty interesting to think about that in the law, the Endangered Species Act says we cannot take federally listed endangered fish and wildlife without a permit. And the law itself defines take to include harm. But the law does not define harm. That's what the rules do, and that's what's changed.
What was the process for redefining harm in a way that changes this Endangered Species Act to challenge the habitat of some of these plants and animals? Was this did this happen overnight? Was this years in the making? And who was behind its making, as you see it, Adena?
This was years in the making.
Huh.
The Yeah, they went through what I would view as generally the normal rulemaking process of putting out a proposed rule. And that rule received 358,000 comments from across the country. So there was a lot of interest in that. And then they finalized the rule. They put out their final rule last month. And that final rule will go into effect in September coming up here.
The story I read from Danielle Kading at WPR.org says that there are some lawsuits that have been filed to challenge this rule change. What role can the courts play in this, Adena?
Well, that's going to be the big question as to whether the courts put a stop to this change or not. There have been requests for preliminary injunctions, which would stop this rule from going into effect. But it's not clear exactly what the courts will do. Long term, though, it does appear that part of the strategy would be to get this case to the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn a 1995 decision called Sweet Home that upheld the agency's discretion to define harm as including significant habitat modification or degradation that actually injures or kills an animal.
Part of this is about the intent of the law itself, correct? What was the Endangered Species Act of 1973 intending if it was not to address habitat loss, Adena?
Well, the goal of the Endangered Species Act was to conserve threatened and endangered species and the ecosystems on which they depend. So that is in the law. What is tricky about the Endangered Species Act is it applies to so many kinds of questions and so many kinds of practices on the ground, and with really different kinds of species. So there's, everything from bats and butterflies to
orchids,
whales. Exactly. Yeah. And so it was trying to cover a lot, but really the Endangered Species Act is an end of the line kind of measure to try to prevent extinction. And so what I think we really need to focus on is keeping common species common, as well as trying to prevent these extinctions so that we don't end up in this situation. Now, Wisconsin has 2 species that have habitat conservation plans here in the state. And as I mentioned, you can take endangered species if you have a permit and a conservation plan in place. And these plans try to provide that regulatory flexibility so that people can still do a lot of actions on the ground without threatening the extinction of that species. So one of those is for the Carner blue butterfly, a lovely powder blue butterfly that likes to feed on lupine flowers and is mostly in central Wisconsin in the sandy soils. And the other is for bats in the Great Lakes region. Now, the bat story is a tough one because we have had white nose syndrome come in and take down our bat population to, in some cases, 1% of what it had been or even less. And that's especially been threatening for the northern long-eared bat, actually endangering for the northern long-eared bat, which is federally listed as endangered. So then the question is, well, if there's only a few bat roost trees or hibernacula left in the state that have bats, how do we protect those trees without providing an undue burden on our loggers and our foresters who are making plans and our landowners? Because we know that these are really important and viable, sustainable industries. And so that's the goal of these habitat conservation plans, is to provide that balance and ideally a workable solution for everybody.
That sounds reasonable. Can you, Professor of Natural Resources Policy and Management at UW-Madison, Adena Rissman, our guest, can you take the position or explain the position of why to change the definition of harm and what that could benefit or why that would be in a priority of this federal administration?
Well, one of the interesting things about the rulemaking is they didn't provide a new definition of harm. They just rescinded the old definition and haven't proposed and in fact concluded that they don't need a new definition. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to actually end up happening based on that or how the agencies are supposed to move forward. But certainly there's been a lot of concerns from a variety of interest groups who feel that they're overregulated on the ground. And maybe it's just that people don't want to deal with the extra paperwork or having to deal with federal agency staff who they may not have close relationships with on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things about it is that regulation, doesn't always feel like common sense to everybody on the ground. And so when you have situations where people are saying, like, in terms of forest harvest, it's not the fault of the timber industry that the bats declined down to 1%, right? There was this new emerging fungal disease that really wiped out the bats. And they're the ones on the ground who are having to now try to map these remaining roost trees and figure out how to prevent harm to the species going forward. And I guess I would argue that we should have an affinity for our endangered species as well as for our land stewards on the ground, folks like loggers and farmers who are making their living outdoors. And we need to have viable ways that they can really see the benefits of the good stewardship that they're doing.
So it feels like for industry, the onus could be on them to protect these endangered species, and maybe that could be misplaced. So if we don't place the onus on the industry, who would be responsible for protecting, defending these habitats and ensuring the populations of threatened and endangered species persists and the common species stay common, as you say?
Right. Well, I think to me, it's really an all hands kind of situation. We've seen a lot of threats increasing from habitat loss to changes in extreme storm events, the kind of smoke that affects us as humans also affects a lot of other species. So we see a lot of these threats, unfortunately, increasing. Meanwhile, we've seen some declines in the kinds of ways that we have to protect species, the kinds of funding and staff that are available to work on species protection. So I really think it should be an all hands on deck moment to come together and figure out how to put workable solutions into place.
Adena, finally today, what can we do to help out our endangered and threatened species in Wisconsin? If there was an action we could take or something we could do, what would that be?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, there's a lot that people can do. There's been a lot of success stories. I was just out this last weekend on a boat and watched a bald eagle skim over the lake and go to its nest. And I just felt so grateful that so many people have been working to conserve our habitats and our wildlife and plants for so long. I was also out this morning looking at my bee balm in my garden and noticing all the pollinators going to it. And so, promoting small things like planting pollinator habitat, as well as thinking about our purchases when we're buying paper, for instance. Does it have that logo from a sustainability source like FSC or SFI that people might see on their paper package? And then staying active, communicating their values. There's a lot that can be done to help move things in a good direction.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us today and bringing us up to date and giving us the perspective from a number of points of view. Adena Rissman, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Adena Rissman's professor of natural resources policy and management at UW-Madison. We'll turn next to Stan Temple, who is a professor emeritus in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And as you're listening to the conversation, if you have questions, you are welcome to join us at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. You can also email us to talk@wpr.org. And Stan, are you there?
I am. I'm sorry that it has to be under a situation in which we're talking about bad news for wildlife.
We are always grateful to have you join us, and thank you so much for being here today. And you've got a rather unique perspective on this because you played at least a small role in the lobbying that helped create the Endangered Species Act of 1973 in the first place.
Which gives you a clue how old I am.
But also gives you a clue of what stake you have in this game and how. So give us a little bit of before 1973 and what was happening in the conservation movement and the attempt to protect our species that were threatened by diminished populations prior to the Endangered Species Act.
Well, it was during the 1960s that endangered species, and you might say the extinction crisis, really came to the forefront, both nationally and internationally. And in 1966, our federal government passed the very first piece of legislation that dealt with endangered species. It was called the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And it did a very simple thing. It said it was illegal to kill endangered species. It didn't address any of the most prevalent sources of threats to endangered species, but it did at least put endangered species on the federal legislative map. It was followed up in 1969 by the Endangered Species Conservation Act, which was it didn't do much more than the Endangered Species Preservation Act did, but the one thing that it added was it allowed the federal government to participate in international efforts to prevent species from becoming endangered and going extinct. And by 1969, and as you indicated earlier in the show, even 100 years ago, conservationists were well aware that the main threat to species was habitat loss. And there was nothing in these two prior pieces of legislation that addressed the big underlying threat to species. So by the late 1960s, and specifically in 1969, when I got involved as a graduate student through a fellowship that let me participate in the lobbying, you might say, but the run-up to the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And the two things that were considered by the conservation community to be absolutely essential in this new law was, first, that it provide protection for the habitat that endangered species need, and secondly, that it do more than just take a passive sort of posture of just protecting the species from further harm, and instead put the emphasis on managing the species so that it can recover and no longer be endangered. So it was interesting for me. It was my first effort or attempt to get involved in federal policy and legislation. And I must say, in 1969, I naively thought, wow, this is not a big deal at all. Basically, the Endangered Species Act, as it was being proposed, was a completely nonpartisan issue. It was basically hardly opposed at all. In fact, it eventually, when the act actually was voted on, it sailed through the Senate without a single dissenting vote and sailed through the House with just a handful of dissenting votes. So it was a very popular, and still to this day remains a very popular piece of legislation. And the two things that it did that were so key was protecting the critical habitat of endangered species and threatened species, and providing a mechanism for managing them to recovery. And Lee, it's so blatantly obvious in the Endangered Species Act that it is the first thing when you read the text. The first thing you read is the purpose of the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And I'm going to quote this just because it is such a clear statement. It says, the purpose of this act is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be conserved, and to provide a program for the conservation of such endangered species and threatened species. So there they are, right in the purpose of the act, protecting habitat and providing for the management to affect the recovery of these species.
overwhelmingly bipartisan when it was passed, and as Adena was talking about seeing a bald eagle earlier this weekend, and I couldn't help but think of there's one of the animals that has directly benefited from some of the work that you put in and the result of the Endangered Species Act of 1973, and yet then changed last month on the what seemingly was a turn of a dime and a removal of a single definition of a single word and what is harm and what that means. I want to go to your questions now for our guest, Dan Temple, at 1-800-642-1234 or talk@wpr.org. And there is so much more to this story, so we'll continue, but I want to take a moment for David in Toma. Hi, David.
Yeah, hi. I've got a suggestion to solve this problem, at least for Wisconsin, and maybe catch on elsewhere.
Go ahead.
We could have we could have a moratorium and/or prohibition on new permits for roads and sanitary permits, and that would eliminate building in the habitat and eliminate putting in new subdivisions and things.
What about the timber industry? Adena talked about that, and it certainly made me think that we're weighing, the economic impacts of protecting our species.
Well, I think these would be major steps, and I think the timber industry can be regulated. That's a whole other topic, but I think these two items would have long-term beneficial effects.
But we've also at the same time talked about concerns over lack of housing, and the need for more housing was on a recent show, and we've got to build housing in Wisconsin. But would a moratorium or prohibition on these sort of licenses and contracts be a possible solution, Stan?
Well, it raises an issue of what can be done quite outside the realm of the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah.
And that is that there certainly are lots of things that could be done at the state and local level that would especially serve to protect the habitat of endangered species. The guest called in, mentioned a couple, but unfortunately, when we look at putting endangered species future in the hands of the state or the individual states, it isn't very workable because only a handful of states have the type of state-level legislation that allows them to really address the needs of endangered species. Wisconsin is not among those that has a very strong endangered species law. We do have one on the books, but it does not provide for protecting habitat. The other thing that is important about sort of shifting the burden to individual states and localities is that it never could possibly lead to a uniform protection for habitat or for the species across their entire range. Species, unfortunately, don't line up very well with political boundaries. And that means that if you're going to try to protect a species, you need to do it across its range, across multiple jurisdictions, not just sort of piecemeal.
And David, thank you for the call. And David's call makes me think of all the things that the Endangered Species Act is up against and why there might be interest in reforming this act or changing it through the undefining of a single word by writ of rule from the Trump administration. Can you see the argument on the other side of this, Stan? Is there a case to be made that maybe there is some way to, compromise?
Yes, and it has been happening ever since 1973. Throughout the history of the Endangered Species Act, there have been a series of compromises that have allowed for potential conflicts between the needs of endangered species and special interest groups, whether that's private landowners or certain industries. But there have been ways for them to work out their differences with the protection of the endangered species. The first and most important of those is through the habitat conservation planning process. That means that if a project that requires federal approval has an what appears to be an irreconcilable conflict with the needs of an endangered species, it is possible to get a habitat conservation plan, which basically allows the aggrieved party, not the endangered species, but the aggrieved party, to agree that we can alter the habitat of a species and allow our project to take place if we mitigate the losses by improving or creating additional habitat for the species or doing other measures that benefit the species somewhere else.
Stan, how long has that habitat conservation plan been part of the Endangered Species Act?
It was very, very early on. So that change took place, I believe, in 1978. So very early on in the process. So it was recognized, that there had to be a way to resolve these differences. And since then, there have just been a whole series, there are probably now more than a half a dozen different ways that private landowners or industry can resolve the differences that they might have with endangered species.
Stan, I want to take a moment here and just reintroduce you. I got to take a break, but when we come back, I want to look at all the different ways that the Endangered Species Act has evolved to adapt, to compromise, to make accommodations, and then the change that took place last month and what that could mean not just for endangered species, but also for those that may be endangered or once were. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you are listening to WPR News. So a couple weeks ago, the Trump administration finalized a rule that redefines the Endangered Species Act of 1973 as we know it. It took the word harm and removed its definition entirely. Earlier, we spoke with Adena Rissman, who is a professor of natural resources policy and management at UW-Madison, about these changes. And our guest now on the Lee Rayburn Show is Stan Temple, professor emeritus in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, also a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation, and someone who had a small role in lobbying for the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, which, as he says, was near unanimous and certainly bipartisan and not controversial at all. And it's been compromised, it's been adapted, it's been acclimated to industry and special interests since then to some degree. As Danielle Kading reports from WPR News, there are lawsuits that have been filed following the Trump administration's changing of the rule of the Endangered Species Act, which is to take effect in September, by the way. So what questions do you have for our guest, Stan Temple, and the endangered or threatened species in Wisconsin? Join us at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. Or send us an email to talk@wpr.org. And Stan, I guess considering that the rule change now is in the hands of the courts, I'd like to take a look a little bit at what the courts have said in the past about the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and how they viewed this law as it faced tests with the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, certainly the Endangered Species Act has been challenged on a number of occasions. And, there have been court battles almost from the very beginning. The first one came in 1978 when it became apparent that the habitat needs of a little fish in Tennessee was going to stand in the way of a federal dam project. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1978. And the Supreme Court in 1978 ruled that it was unambiguous in the Endangered Species Act that the purpose was to halt and reverse the threats to endangered species. And the quote added on to that is important, whatever the cost. In other words, the Supreme Court said the endangered species will always win, essentially, in these conflicts. they have to be accommodated, whether they do that through compromise or not. The Endangered Species Act always wins. Well, that led to the creation eventually of what has affectionately been known as the God Squad. The God Squad being a committee that is appointed by whatever the current administration is in Washington to decide how these irreconcilable conflicts will be resolved. And the God Squad, since it was created, has only met 3 times. Huh. And now the God Squad is being called into action again as a result of these proposed changes to the Endangered Species Act. But there was more going on in the courts. In 1975, there was a major court decision. 1995, there was a major Supreme Court decision that had to do specifically with the definition of harm, including habitat destruction. And again, the Supreme Court rather unambiguously came out in favor of the Endangered Species Act and the protections that it afforded under the definition of harm, including habitat loss. So there have been a whole series of these court cases that have gone all the way to the Supreme Court in 2 cases that have generally stood up for the Endangered Species Act.
Well, and that stands out to me, Stan, because when we spoke to Adena Rissman, she suggested that the expectation is, or the hope is, for those who want to remove the definition of harm in the Endangered Species Act, is to make this back to the Supreme Court and perhaps change precedent that has been set, established, and reestablished over and over again.
Well, that's a tough one. It is a double-edged sword because there's often no way of predicting how the Supreme Court might rule, and especially because in 2024, the Supreme Court, in a ruling that had nothing directly to do with the Endangered Species Act, challenged, as a result of a challenge to what had been known as the Chevron deference. Mm-hmm. This was a legal opinion that in cases where there is a conflict between a rule proposed by the federal government to basically bring about the purposes of a piece of legislation, that the courts should always defer to the federal agencies unless it is just blatantly clear that whatever the rules are were made in error or were not defensible. So that had stood for decades, and in 2024, the Supreme Court ruled that the Chevron deference doctrine no longer applied, which meant that courts now plaintiffs could individually challenge rules in court, and the courts would decide the outcome rather than always deferring to the federal agencies and the rules that they've made.
Well, that's interesting. So the Supreme Court a couple of years ago changed precedent, shifting the authority from the rule makers to the courts. And so now that the rule makers have changed the Endangered Species Act of 1973, it'll ultimately be up to the courts as a result of this decision to figure out what that means.
That is going to be the case. And as I said, that the Chevron decision in 2024, it essentially opened the door.
Wow.
For these changes or reinterpretations of the Endangered Species Act's rules.
And going back to what Adena told us is that, they didn't redefine harm, they just removed the definition of harm. So now harm in the Endangered Species Act of 1973 is completely unclear.
And it will be up to courts to decide on a case-by-case basis whether whatever the action might be is to be interpreted as harm to a species.
So instead of having a blanket Endangered Species Act with these habitat conservation plans, you're going to have lawsuit after lawsuit that will be going to the courts, as you see it, Stan Temple, to define what harm may be for these species?
I'm afraid that is probably what the crystal ball says is going to happen in the future. And of course, all of this hinges on legal action that's happening right now. There are literally dozens of lawsuits that have either been filed or will be filed challenging not only the redefinition of harm, but also some of the other rule changes that the current administration has made that affect the Endangered Species Act. So stay tuned. The courts are going to be busy with the Endangered Species Act for some time to come, but that in itself is harmful because it's going to play out over years.
Well,
and that means that for a long time, things will be in legal limbo.
Not just the Endangered Species Act, then, Stan, the Clean Water Act. It could be any number of environmental protections that were put in place back as, when you describe it, they weren't a partisan issue. They were passed with bipartisan support. I want to take a moment to go back to the whatever the cost quote from the Supreme Court decision in 1978. I've got that highlighted because I wanted to ask you why they decided, whatever the cost, that they needed to reverse the trend towards species extinction, that they needed to protect habitat. Did they decide this because the Supreme Court were environmentalists, or what was the basis for saying, whatever the cost, the Endangered Species Act of 1973 needs to protect the species?
It was strictly a legal opinion based on the statute itself, on the Endangered Species Act. As they said, it made it pretty clear in the statute itself, not necessarily in the rules that accompany the act, but in the act itself, that we were dedicating our nation to preventing species from going extinct, and that we should do whatever we can to prevent that from happening. So adding that, whatever the costs, to the ruling was very much in keeping with the way the Endangered Species Act intended our sort of legal system to abide by that pledge as a nation.
The intent of the law was clear, according to the Supreme Court in 1978. The intent of the law remained clear, according to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1995. And what happens next might depend on any number of courts at any number of different levels regarding any number of different species, which makes me wonder what that means for Wisconsin. I want to get to a call here, but let me reintroduce our guest, Stan Temple, Senior Fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at UW-Madison. And you're welcome here, too, at 1-800-642-1234 or talk at WPR.org. Let's go to Susie in Manitowoc next. Hi, Susie.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. The name of Stan Temple is well known in our household because our son studied with Stan, was in his class, and he is now with the Nature Conservancy as global freshwater scientist. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, so yay.
What a wonderful legacy.
Yeah, we take great pride in the students that have gone on to do great things.
Yeah. Susie, do you have anything else for us today?
I do. I want people to know about this book, which was published to sell. It's called A Wild Promise, an illustrated celebration of the Endangered Species Act. It has an introductory essay by Terry Tempest Williams, which I've read multiple times. It's by Alan Crawford, who did beautiful photography and wonderful calligraphy, and it tells the status of each animal, whether it's still endangered or if it's been taken off the list, or all sorts of levels that an animal would be. Absolutely beautiful. I loved it so much that I wrote an essay in the front, and said, you must read this because we have 4 sons, and gave it to them for Christmas. It's an absolutely beautiful book.
Susie, thank you so much. A Wild Promise by Alan Crawford. Do you have a copy yet, Stan?
I do, and actually, books like this, and there are lots that celebrate the amazing success of the Endangered Species Act. 99% of the species that have gotten on to the endangered or threatened list are still with us. We've only lost, a couple. And significantly, many of the species that were on the list have gotten off the list in the very positive way that they've recovered, one of which is a species that I was very much involved with, the peregrine falcon. So the Endangered Species Act has this amazing track record of success. So the way Congress wrote it and the way the courts have reinterpreted it have stood the test of time and seem to be doing a good job at their intended purpose. But there's a problem, and that is that once a species becomes threatened or endangered, we're often doing too little, too late to help it. It's basically in the 11th hour, which makes it difficult for people like me who spent their career trying to design recovery programs up against a huge challenge. If species had gotten help sooner, it would have been a lot easier. And then you add to it our impatience, that we think that just because a species got listed and has a recovery plan that magically overnight it's going to come off the endangered species list. And critics routinely offer this as a criticism, saying that, look, there are all these species that are listed that haven't come off the list. The Endangered Species Act, therefore, must be failing. The Endangered Species Act is doing its job. It just takes time. Often these species declined over decades or even centuries, and to imagine that we're going to suddenly get them back to a healthy status in a matter of years or decades is just completely irrational. It just makes no sense at all.
Susie, thank you for the call. Pardon me. And the recommendation of Wild Promise, Alan Crawford, now on my list. Let's go to Jerry and Kokona next. Jerry, hi.
Yes. One of the things, we got an opportunity coming up in November to vote for Congress people who actually appreciate the environment and the outdoors and the wildlife. We have one here in our district, District 8, Mr. Weed, that doesn't give a hoot about the environment. And it's time to get people who vote your values and to put new laws in place.
Jerry, thank you for the call. And Adena Rissman addressed the other side of this, that it's up against special development, it's up against industry, it's up against economic factors that have to have some weight in this discussion. It's understandable. Tim in Madison emailed us and wants to congratulate you, Stan, for what you've done for the Endangered Species Act. He also echoes Jerry's comment about the answers at the ballot box. People need to elect judges in Congress, people who care about natural resources. And you can't talk about policy without talking about politics, but the way you talk about politics, I think, probably needs to be carefully approached, because there are two sides to these debates, and we need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And as I said, over the history of the Endangered Species Act, there have been lots of compromises, probably not enough. There probably do need to be changes to the Endangered Species Act that will only happen if we elect people to Congress who care about endangered species and want to make the Endangered Species Act even better than it is. Right now, there certainly are not enough resources being directed toward the recovery of endangered species. Ever since 1973, the Endangered Species Act has never, ever been adequately funded.
Huh.
And over just the last year, of course, the primary agency responsible for the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, had its staff reduced by 20% and its funding cut by 32%. So these are changes that will make it even more difficult. In addition to all these legal things that have been playing out in the background, just make it more and more difficult for the federal agencies that are responsible to carry out the mandate of the Endangered Species Act.
But the argument that we started with this hour had nothing to do with Congress. It was a presidential administration decision to alter a rule that undefined a word completely, and that word is harm. And I think it's worth asking how we define harm. And when it comes to understanding conservation as we do today, with the interconnectedness of our animals and plants and our habitat and our ecosystems, can we talk about harm without talking about habitat destruction or infringement? And I think scientifically, Stan, most folks would say the answer is pretty clear.
I think most people, you don't need a degree in ecology or having had taken one of my classes to understand that if you destroy or alter the place that an animal or plant needs to live, that you're doing harm to it. So, the word common sense is often bandied around when we discuss changes in rules and legislation, and this one just seems to be common sense, and it seems like a real logical stretch as well as probably a legal stretch to abandon the notion that harm includes destroying habitat.
Again, Jerry, I thank you for the call. Tim, thank you for the email, because when we're talking about policy, we are talking about politics. But when we used to talk about the Endangered Species Act, it wasn't a partisan thing we were talking about. But apparently maybe it is more so today than it used to be, like so many other things, and maybe we should take some time to think and talk about that as well. Let's go to Tanya in Stevens Point next. Tanya, hello.
Hi, I want to just thank you so much for your hard life work trying to protect, the species that we have, and it is just heart-wrenching to see these things being undone today, and hopefully you just make more people like us stronger to stand up and fight against it and make it even better than that. That's all we can hope for, right? But I did also want to, I don't know if you know them or not, but I had the incredible pleasure of working for James Watrous and Emily Early when I was younger, and they were definitely in the National Crane Foundation. I think they were original founders of that, or had something to do with that. And they were Mr. and Mrs. Watrous were wonderful people, and Emily Early would listen to Chapter of the Day when I was at her house cleaning for her, and that's what got me hooked on the WPR.
Oh, thank you. The Crane Foundation, the whooping crane's still on the endangered species list, right? And you also mentioned the piping plover is something that might be affected by these changes. I also think of the animals that have been delisted, like the peregrine falcon, as you mentioned, Stan, the bald eagle, the Kirtland warbler, or the challenge species that may end up on this list as a result. What's the outcome of this change as you see it going forward, especially in Wisconsin?
Well, there are two things that change. We've talked a lot about the sort of redefinition of harm, but the other thing that changed by rulemaking was that threatened species will no longer be afforded the full protections of the Endangered Species Act. And that means that threatened species, these are species that are headed toward the endangered status unless we do something to reverse their downward trend. It means that more and more of these threatened species are going to become endangered. In Wisconsin, we mentioned that there were 25 threatened and endangered species. 16 of them are endangered and 9 of them are threatened. And among those 25 species, the ones that are likely to be most affected are species that have some relationship to water and wetlands, because many of our species depend on those types of habitat. So, for example, we mentioned the piping plover, which nests on the shores of the Great Lakes, prime real estate development, which would no longer be considered a harm if real estate development on the Great Lakes shore altered some of the nesting habitat for piping plover. Similarly, there are plants like the dwarf lake iris, which is found primarily in Door County, and it's found again in wetlands along the shore, prime real estate development. And again, it would no longer, those types of developments that might alter wetlands would no longer be considered harm to those species. The biggest group of species that are endangered in Wisconsin are actually mussels, freshwater mussels. We have 5 that just recently were advanced from threatened status to endangered status. They're just have the most delightful names. Somebody had a whimsical view of clams when they came up with these names.
Stan, I'm sorry. We're going to have to return to this conversation another time. I have just run out of time with you, but I do want to echo Tanya and everybody else. I want to thank you for your lifetime of work, and I want to welcome you back here anytime. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I thank you for it.
Happy to do it.
Stan Temple, I'm curious about the mussel names now. We'll have to get back to that. Is a professor emeritus in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at UW-Madison, senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. Thanks for all the calls and the emails today and being a part of our show. Thanks to our team as well. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you are listening to WPR News.